Yeah, so I'm doing what Richard suggested maybe we shouldn't do, which is attempt to take a precautionary approach sort of broadly and make it into some sort of action guiding decision rule. And I think my approach is going to be quite susceptible to a couple of problems that he's already raised, but maybe we can figure out in the discussion whether this is completely devastating. And the way that I came about this topic is I've been thinking a lot, especially during the pandemic, about how we can provide justification for the kinds of severe measures that we implemented during the pandemic, like lockdowns. And I'm particularly interested in the state of affairs that we were in right at the beginning of the pandemic. So where information concerning our potential courses of action was just really uncertain. We were kind of in this epistemic state where we had some idea, at least, this is what I want to claim, about credible risks, but we weren't in a position where we could really make sort of probability judgments about how likely certain outcomes were to obtain. And the reason that I'm in here taking a precautionary approach is it seems to fit in a way quite nicely with how policymakers were sort of making these decisions. It seems potentially the case that they had some sort of precautionary idea in mind, that we really want to stave off these very worst case scenarios, these catastrophic scenarios, although we weren't really certain about whether they would obtain or not. But when we kind of delve into what a precautionary principle can actually recommend in concrete terms, it becomes very difficult to provide a robust justification on these sorts of grounds. So today I'm going to try out an attempt to kind of make a precautionary principle into something that can provide this sort of robust justification, and this is based on work that I've been doing with Matthias Frisch. So the precautionary principle, very broadly, we've already had some indication of what this does, is supposed to provide us with a justification for taking action to prevent potential severe or catastrophic harm when we cannot determine how likely this harm is to occur. And we often see, as Richard also already mentioned, a precautionary approach utilised or invoked when we're talking about climate action. So we might not be able to establish how likely the truly catastrophic worst case scenarios are to occur if we fail to act. But some people argue these potential consequences are so terrible that we shouldn't let uncertainty stop us from taking action in these cases. And we can see a similar idea invoked in other scientific policy contexts too. We might have a chemical which we believe could be extremely toxic, but this hasn't been established with sufficient certainty. Gathering further information before intervening to prevent the potential threat has led to negative outcomes in the past. So some argue in order to avoid these outcomes, we should not regard certainty or even being able to establish the probability of a particular outcome as a necessary condition of acting on scientific findings. Under certain circumstances, where a potential threat is severe enough and constitutes a realistic possibility, we should be able to act on uncertain information to prevent the threat. So my conjecture here is this precautionary reasoning seems very much akin to how policymakers were thinking right at the beginning of the pandemic, when they were first considering whether to impose lockdowns. Scientific evidence about the virus was just beginning to emerge, and epidemiological modelling about the potential causes of the pandemic was subject to significant uncertainties. Yet the unrestrained spread of the virus posed a severe, potentially catastrophic threat. However, despite these similarities, it's very difficult to find a concrete action-guiding formulation of the precautionary principle that would justify the decision to impose lockdowns. And this is because of a more general problem with the precautionary principle, which is made particularly pertinent, I think, by the situation faced in the early months of the pandemic. the precautionary measures that appeared to be required to prevent the potentially catastrophic effects of insufficiently mitigated viral spread, i.e. lockdowns, themselves posed a serious threat of harm, potentially. If precautionary reasoning is intended to steer us away from the course of action that presents a serious risk of harm, the precautionary principle leads us to paralysis in this case. That is, it seems to recommend both for and against imposing lockdowns. So this problem of paralysis is a very well-recognized problem for the precautionary principle. And although there have been some sophisticated attempts to formulate a precautionary principle that avoids paralysis, I'm going to argue that they're not adequately equipped to deal with this type of situation. So this is my plan for the rest of the session. I'm going to look at two very prominent formulations of the precautionary principle from Stephen Gardner and from Daniel Steele, focusing particularly on how they attempt to avoid the problem of paralysis. I'll begin with Stephen Gardner's solution, which does successfully avoid paralysis by narrowing the scope of the principle. But this comes at the cost of rendering it inapplicable to circumstances that require costly precautionary measures. I'll suggest that we can both expand the scope of the principle and avoid paralysis by looking to a feature of the early pandemic. In the face of uncertainty, when all our alternatives for action involve potential grave harm, there may nevertheless be an asymmetry between our alternatives, concerning a possibility of later control or intervention to prevent potential harms. Incorporating a condition which captures this asymmetry allows us to widen the scope of Gardner's precautionary principle to cover high-cost precautionary measures. I'll then turn to Daniel Steele's approach to a precautionary principle, which avoids paralysis through a requirement of consistency. I'll argue that Steele's precautionary principle can only be made to generate consistent recommendations in the pandemic case, again, if we incorporate this asymmetry. And I should note before proceeding that although I'm focusing chiefly on the pandemic in motivating and formulating this asymmetry condition, it may have relevance for all situations where high-cost measures may be necessary to stave off a catastrophic threat, including potentially effective action against the climate crisis. I should also make a few general comments about the formulation of an adequate precautionary principle. Both Gardner and Steele present one of the most significant challenges to the formulation of an adequate action-guiding precautionary principle as a dilemma. We don't want our formulation of the principle to be too weak or vacuous to provide an effective guide for action. We might all be able to agree, for example, that scientific uncertainty should not prevent us from taking action to avoid a credible risk of harm. But this as a principle doesn't give us much of an indication of precisely when we are warranted in taking action and what action might be warranted. But attempts to provide a more specific, concrete precautionary principle also runs into difficulties. If we suggest, for example, in an attempt to formulate an action-guiding version of the precautionary principle, that any activity that presents a credible risk of serious harm should be prohibited, we run into the aforementioned problem of paralysis. Many feasible measures that we can take against a precaution themselves involve a credible threat of serious harm. Actions that we deem likely to be effective against climate change, for example, could involve significant economic harm. The impositions of lockdowns in the early, highly uncertain stages of the pandemic to prevent the spread of COVID-19 involved quite serious harms. Thus, the precautionary principle appears to result in paralysis or incoherence in these cases, because its stipulations recommend both for and against the precautionary measure. So how can we avoid this horn of the dilemma? One option would be to focus only on certain types of harms. for example, on environmental harms or public health harms to the exclusion of economic harms. But this is a rather unsatisfactory answer. There doesn't seem to be any principled reason why certain types of harms shouldn't count. We should want, as Gardner claims, something comprehensive. So let's look first at how Gardner attempts to provide us with a comprehensive, action-guiding precautionary principle that avoids paralysis. Gardner suggests that we can avoid many of the problems facing the precautionary principle by taking a Rawlsian-inspired approach to formulating a core precautionary principle, designed to apply to many of the typical situations in which we might want to use precautionary reasoning. Gardner starts from the observation that there is a similarity in precautionary reasoning and Rawls's maxi-min principle. Both are intended to avoid the worst outcome, and both are designed to be implemented under uncertainty. But as Gardner notes, and this speaks to a comment that we had in the previous talk, maxi-min is not a good decision-making guide in all situations. In some cases, it appears to be implausibly risk-averse. For example, I could remain inside on a lovely summer's day, or I could go to the park across the street to meet some friends. But while crossing the road outside, there is a very small possibility that I might be hit by a car. Because maxi-min only cares about avoiding the worst outcome and does not focus on potential gains, it would recommend that I stay indoors. Gardner suggests that we can avoid these unintuitive results by restricting the scope of his maxi-min-inspired precautionary principle. More precisely, we can determine when we should use the precautionary principle by looking at the 3 restrictions that Rawls places on the application of maxi-min reasoning. So here are Rawls's restrictions. First, the situation should be one in which a knowledge of likelihoods is impossible or at best extremely insecure. So this is just a restatement that it should be a situation of true uncertainty where we can't assign precise probabilities. 2, the decision makers must care relatively little for potential gains above the minimum guaranteed by the maxi-min approach. And 3, rejected alternatives have outcomes that we can hardly accept. By limiting the scope of the precautionary principle, just as when we limit the scope of the maxi-min principle, perhaps we can avoid unintuitive outcomes like inconsistent recommendations. In order to see how this works, let's consider Gardner's response to a challenge to action on climate change by Bjorn Lomborg. Lomborg claims, and I quote, that we should care a great deal about the opportunity costs of climate mitigation. Now, Gardner questions the veracity of this claim, but he also contends that what Lomborg's challenge amounts to is an assertion that the care little for gains condition is not met in the instance of climate change, and that therefore, rather than as a general challenge to precautionary reasoning, we could read this as a suggestion that precautionary reasoning simply should not be applied to this case. Yet this response comes at a high cost. The care little for gains condition does effectively allow us to avoid the problem of paralysis. The low-cost precautions that fall within the scope of Gardner's principle will not lead to inconsistent recommendations, because we never have to worry about the principle recommending against the severe harm that precautionary measures might bring about. But restricting the scope of the precautionary principle in this way, by suggesting that cases in which mitigation measures involve high costs, and where we are thus likely to care very much about avoiding these costs, fall outside the scope of the precautionary principle, leaves Gardner's approach unable to deal with the difficult climate change and public health cases which I'm concerned with today. And these are the sorts of cases, we might think, where we have particularly pressing need for guidance under uncertainty. I should note here that Gardner does not strictly rule out that the precautionary principle can be applied outside the core cases that he identifies. His conditions here are intended to be jointly sufficient and not individually necessary. But given the urgency and importance of high-cost cases like the climate crisis or the COVID pandemic, it would be useful to have more guidance on whether and how the precautionary principle can be applied to such cases. I'm now going to suggest that a notable feature of the decisions faced in the early COVID-19 pandemic might provide us with a condition that can replace the care little for gain stipulation, thus widening the principle's scope, while also retaining the concern with avoiding the worst outcome, which motivates Gardner to adopt a maxi-min approach to the precautionary principle in the first place. And in order to do this, so we've already heard some of this history covered in previous talks, but let's again take a brief detour to March 23, 2020. This is the day upon which the UK government implemented far-ranging restrictions, including the closure of businesses, dispersal of gatherings of more than 2 people, and restrictions on the circumstances under which one was permitted to leave the house, in order to drastically reduce contact events between individuals and limit the spread of COVID-19. Now, these restrictions, as Jonathan Birch already told us, were implemented a couple of days after the UK's Scientific Advisory Group for Emergencies, or SAGE, discussed a newly released modelling report from the Imperial College London's COVID response team, the famous, or rather infamous at this stage, Report 9. Suggesting that hospital capacity would be exceeded many times over in a matter of weeks unless these measures were implemented. They also observed that the virus was spreading exponentially in Great Britain and that it appeared to be on the same trajectory as many other countries, including Italy, which had already exceeded hospital capacity by this time. In the minutes of their meeting, SAGE repeatedly stressed the limited and uncertain nature of the information available to them. Yet they advise in an uncharacteristically unequivocal fashion that, and this is a quote again, available evidence now supports implementing school closures on a national level as soon as practicable to prevent NHS intensive care capacity being exceeded. So this appears at first sight to be a paradigm case of precautionary reasoning in action. The evidence suggesting that the hospitals would be overwhelmed, an outcome deemed to be catastrophic and unacceptable, was highly uncertain. Certainly, no probabilities could be attached to the likelihood of this outcome. But the measures implemented to prevent this potential outcome had potentially catastrophic social and economic implications of their own. Given the severity of these measures, is this course of action something that could be coherently recommended by a precautionary principle? With potential harms on both sides of the equation, this is clearly not a situation in which we care little for gains. Costs of lockdown or social distancing measures are significant, potentially even harmful enough to rival the harms of an overwhelmed hospital system, or possibly in the long run, worst case COVID fatalities. And even if we were to believe that the harms of locking down would ultimately be less severe, we lacked the information to really balance the potential harms on both sides with a cost-benefit analysis or utility calculation. Although we had some evidence, it was just too uncertain to approach the problem in this way. But there do look to be potentially relevant differences between implementing these lockdown measures and failing to implement them. Let's first look at the consequences of failing to implement the proposed lockdown measures. Viral spread had been observed to grow exponentially, with a doubling time estimated at between 5 and 7 days. This provided a small window to act to prevent the most feared outcome, overwhelmed healthcare systems. Any delay in implementation would require more stringent action to achieve the same effect. And after a few weeks, it was projected that delayed interventions could no longer prevent this outcome. That is, there was reason to believe that failing to act almost immediately would make the occurrence of a future catastrophe uncontrollable, Compare this with the consequences of implementing the lockdown measures. We could expect that some of the negative impacts of closing businesses and schools, for example, would be immediate. But it was also plausible that some of the worst impacts of these measures could be mitigated through financial protections, provisions, and stimulus measures. More importantly for our present concern, there was no reason to think that the negative effects would grow exponentially with time. Arguably, this made possible harms associated with lockdown measures controllable to some degree, in ways in which the harms associated with unrestrained viral spread were not. Even if it were a serious possibility that lockdown measures would result in catastrophic harms, implementing lockdown measures immediately would not make those harms uncontrollable. That is to say, even if we were in a world in which lockdown measures now resulted in catastrophic harms at some later time, we would still have had the possibility to intervene to prevent the worst of these harms. For example, through additional financial support for those affected by lockdown measures, or additional educational measures for children, or by rolling back or lifting the lockdown if the very worst consequences began to look likely to eventuate. While given the uncertainties, we might not know if we are in a world in which unmitigated spread of the virus will lead to catastrophic harms, or in a world in which lockdown measures might lead to catastrophic harms. The difference between the two possibilities is this. If we are in a world in which unmitigated viral spread will lead to a catastrophe, then failing to introduce lockdown measures now will make the catastrophe inevitable. By contrast, if we are in a world in which lockdown measures have catastrophic consequences, we still have the ability at a later time to intervene through additional measures and prevent the catastrophe from occurring. Although we cannot prevent all ensuing harms, the opportunity remains only if this option is pursued to course correct later and avoid the worst possible outcome in this scenario. So if we assume that the credible potential outcomes on both sides were similarly catastrophic, and if we care about avoiding the worst possible outcome, this might speak in favour of implementing the measures. We could thus replace the care little for gains condition with the following condition for when precautionary measures are appropriate. Failing to take precautionary measures makes the occurrence of the possible catastrophic outcomes uncontrollable, while possible catastrophic outcomes resulting from the precautionary measures are still open to being controlled by later actions. Such an alternative condition retains the Rawlsian spirit of Gardner's approach. It is concerned with avoiding the worst outcome by looking at where we can intervene later to prevent it. And it can be implemented under uncertainty. We don't have to know whether the harms of lockdowns will outweigh the harms of failing to impose lockdowns. Since Gardner's Rawlsian care little for gains condition and this alternate condition are not mutually exclusive, we could also disjunctively combine them into a more general condition. Something like, either we care relatively little for potential gains above the minimum, or without precautionary measures, the occurrence of possible catastrophic outcomes becomes uncontrollable, while possible catastrophic outcomes resulting from precautionary measures are still open to being controlled through later actions. So this condition might allow us to make sense of the initial pandemic response as in line with precautionary reasoning. But it could also be part of a decision framework with which to evaluate possible responses to, for example, the climate crisis. Many changes to the climate system, in particular those associated with so-called tipping points, would be irreversible on human timescales. CO2 remains in the atmosphere for a very long time. Once the ice shields become unstable, even small reductions in global surface temperatures will fail to prevent their melting. Thus, unless we take drastic mitigation measures in the very near future, we face uncontrollable climate change with potential catastrophic consequences for human civilization. By contrast, the potential catastrophic consequences of mitigation allow for some degree of control. If the measures implemented to stave off this catastrophic outcome threaten catastrophic effects of their own, if large reductions in fossil fuel use, for example, threaten to result in a dramatic energy crisis and the inability of many people to have their basic needs met, the opportunity remains available to intervene again by adjusting the consumption of fossil fuels. The basic asymmetry between possible climate catastrophe and possible socio-economic catastrophe consists in the fact that economic systems are open to interventions in ways in which the climate system, once certain tipping points are crossed, is not. But there are also other approaches to the precautionary principle. Daniel Steele, for example, provides us with an alternate framework that is intended to encompass high-cost precautionary measures and avoid some of the other problems with Gardner's maxi-min inspired account. So we should look now at whether Steele's approach might provide us with an independent way of solving these problems without invoking the asymmetry condition that I've just sketched. In this final part, I'm also going to suggest that recognition and incorporation of this asymmetry is also an important supplement to Steele's account. Now, Steele argues that the precautionary principle ought to be thought of as an abstract argumentative scheme consisting of a tripod. That is, a knowledge condition, a harm condition, and a recommended precaution. Different ways of specifying these conditions, so setting a threshold for how much knowledge we need, how much harm we need, and what sort of precaution we should take, will result in different versions of the precautionary principle, which are appropriate to different circumstances. His approach is rather complicated, but I think for our purposes, it's not necessary to sketch out all the details. Rather, I'm going to zone in on Steele's approach to avoiding the problem of paralysis. Rather than limiting the scope of application, as does Gardner, Steele introduces a requirement of proportionality consisting of two principles, consistency and efficiency. And these principles are intended to guide the application of the tripod to particular cases, so work out where we should set our knowledge condition, harm condition, and recommended precaution. Consistency, the first part of proportionality, entails that a precaution should not be precluded by the same version of the precautionary principle used to justify it. So this is basically just a stipulation that we avoid the problem of paralysis. To illustrate the utility of this condition, Steele imagines that someone invokes the following version of the precautionary principle to justify a ban on the measles, mumps, rubella vaccine. If it is possible that an activity will lead to serious harm, then that activity should be prohibited. Such an invocation runs up against the problem of paralysis, because banning the MMR vaccine could also result in serious harm. So according to Steele, this could either show us that there is something wrong with the specific formulation of the precautionary principle, that we might need to adjust our knowledge and harm conditions, or that there is something wrong with the proposed measure as a precautionary action. If no adequate specific version of the precautionary principle can consistently recommend a course of action like banning the MMR vaccine, that is, if each formulation that speaks for banning it also speaks against banning it, then the measure cannot be recommended by the precautionary principle. So for Steele, a precaution is recommended by the precautionary principle if the following two conditions are met. First, there is an adequate version of the precautionary principle that consistently recommends the precaution. And second, no adequate version of the precautionary principle consistently recommends any action other than the precaution. So let's turn now to what Steele's approach might say about our pandemic case. And I'll do this by taking three sort of promising, concrete formulations that Steele provides of the precautionary principle. First, if there is some scientific evidence that an activity leads to a significant and irreversible harm, then an alternative should be substituted for that activity if feasible. Option 2, if a scientifically plausible mechanism exists whereby an activity can lead to a catastrophe, then that activity should be phased out or significantly restricted. And 3, if it is possible that an activity will lead to a catastrophe, then that activity should be prohibited. So we can see what he's done here is he's got these different knowledge conditions, so some scientific evidence or possibility. He's got different harm conditions, irreversible harm or catastrophe, and then he's got different recommendations for the course of action that we take. Now, none of these versions of the precautionary principle seem to be able to consistently recommend precautionary lockdown measures. Let's consider version 1. We had some scientific evidence that failing to impose lockdown measures would lead to significant and irreversible harm. But arguably, there was also evidence that some of the social and economic consequences of lockdown measures would also result in significant harm, and harms that, were they to occur, would be irreversible. Moreover, it was not obvious, once we take the long-term effects of lockdown measures into account, that harms resulting from lockdowns are any less catastrophic in terms of life years lost or overall economic costs. The implementation of lockdowns would therefore trigger the harm conditions in versions 2 and 3 as well. Finding a specific combination of the harm and knowledge conditions that would recommend for lockdown measures, but not also recommend against lockdowns, might require the kind of precise scientific evidence that was just not available early in the pandemic. Given the tentative knowledge that was available, each of these formulations appear to result in paralysis. So this might just mean, as with the MMR case, that lockdown measures cannot be justified by an adequate version of the precautionary principle. But I think that the problem goes deeper than that. For Steele also claims that consistency excludes ineffectual precautions. This is because the precautionary principle will recommend against ineffectual precautions for the same reason that it recommends against doing nothing. To take Steele's first formulation as an example, doing nothing and ineffectual precautions could both lead to significant and irreversible harm, and therefore must be substituted for an alternate activity. Why does this pose a problem for Steele's account? Because in the case of lockdowns, it seems that none of these formulations are able to recommend any available course of action without inconsistency. As we've seen, the modelling study that provided some, albeit uncertain, scientific evidence about the trajectory of the pandemic suggested that anything short of the measures implemented, and again this is a quote, would still likely result in hundreds of thousands of deaths and health systems, most notably intensive care units, being overwhelmed many times over. So it seems that the options we have here are doing nothing, which is recommended against by all formulations, implementing the measures, which is recommended both for and against by all formulations because of the severity of lockdown measures, or implementing less severe measures, which each formulation recommends against for the same reason they recommend against doing nothing. And we can easily imagine an analogous situation for climate change. If we are living in a world in which we believe, on the basis of a plausible scientific mechanism, that drastic restrictions are required quickly in order to stave off a climate catastrophe, this could similarly result in potential catastrophe or severe and irreversible harm on both sides, with less drastic measures judged to be ineffectual. So can we come up with a formulation that can provide a consistent recommendation in these cases? I think the answer here is yes, if we incorporate the asymmetry. So the asymmetry here might give us a guide to achieving consistency in this case. we can break the tie between the two potentially harmful outcomes by amending, for example, Steele's second formulation to something like, if a scientifically plausible mechanism exists whereby an activity can lead to a catastrophe, and failing to take precautionary measures makes the occurrence of the catastrophe uncontrollable, then that activity should be phased out or significantly restricted. So this formulation can provide us with a consistent recommendation. Impose lockdown measures early in the pandemic, but pair these with measures that buffer possible social and economic effects in ways that would make later interventions to prevent potential catastrophic consequences of these lockdown measures possible. Now, this suggestion might be regarded as a variant on Steele's requirement of efficiency. This is the second part of Steele's proportionality requirement. Efficiency amounts to the demand that we take the least costly precautions necessary to avoid our feared catastrophic outcome. As Steele fleshes this out, however, efficiency amounts to a search for more measured or less drastic alternative precautions when the costs of the proposed precautions are high. For example, when discussing what his precautionary principle would recommend, where adding harmful chemicals to a lake is believed to be the only potential means and not a guaranteed means of saving it, Steele challenges the artificial assumption that the only options are to add the chemicals or to do nothing at all. For instance, he suggests, why not begin by adding the chemicals in small quantities, and then make future decisions about whether to add more, contingent on the observation of some positive response. Now, this seems like an appropriate response to this particular problem, but in the cases I've been discussing, as we've seen, the initial implementation of weaker measures, like only some of the recommended social distancing measures, or just a moderate reduction in emissions, is likely to amount to an ineffectual precaution. But in these cases, we can minimize the burdens of these measures by other means. By implementing them in full force, mitigating the worst effects, and rolling them back if they are more harmful than anticipated, more stringent than necessary, or unable in the end to prevent the catastrophe against which they were imposed. So just to briefly recap, though decision makers often make appeals to precautionary considerations in the face of uncertain yet serious threats of harm, influential attempts to provide an adequately formulated precautionary principle run into trouble when faced with situations in which the precautionary measures required to stave off catastrophe have potentially catastrophic effects of their own. I've attempted to draw out this problem with reference to two such attempts and to provide a means of circumventing it. Both Gardner and Steele's formulations of the precautionary principle can be made to provide coherent and consistent guidance if we recognize and incorporate a condition that captures an asymmetry of future control between our alternatives. This asymmetry condition makes sense of the implementation of lockdown measures in the early pandemic as a coherent precautionary response, but may also assist us in another paradigmatic situation in which precautionary action is often called for as a response to a looming climate catastrophe. Thank you.